I'm here with Stephanie Laingen and Chris Todd from our partner TapHere to dive into some of the strategies for building a communication-centric culture that empowers distributed teams. I am Audrey Markham. I am partner manager for Inflectra and also a remote worker myself. And I'll be moderating today's discussion where we're going to cover some topics like what communication platforms and tools make up a good communication system, communicating through code, understanding the role of leadership in building a strong foundation for communication, and some more. With that being said, I will pass it off to you guys to present yourselves.
Thanks, guys, for joining today. As Audrey mentioned, I'm with TapHere Technology. We're partners with Inflectra. For the past few years, we've really been honing in on technology partners and helping them enable their customers. And so one of the joys of my job is that I get to work with a lot of different teams. And I move all the time. So I'm like in Georgia right now. I was living in Tucson a couple years ago and Texas before that. So remote work has really been something that's enabled me to do my job really well and working with customers all around. And so my title right now is the Director of Innovation. So really that title doesn't mean anything. It just means that I'm constantly looking for ways for us to produce better solutions for our customers and to find new ways for us to enable them within the government space, defense space, and commercial. So that's a little bit of my technology background.
Thanks, Steph. So my name is Chris Todd. I founded TapHere with my business partner, Jack Runninger, about 16 years ago. We focus mainly on the federal sector, but we also do work in things like education and healthcare. So mostly institutional type areas. I've been working lately kind of hybrid. I have to go into classified facilities sometimes, and I probably travel about 1/3 to half of the time. So that's another aspect to this, working from hotels, working from wherever you might be, and keeping abreast of everything. So I'm usually on the go, but more of a hybrid. So we've kind of, adapted to that. Now more people are coming back into the office. But we still have a very distributed team. And we've always kind of supported that COVID really did move it, but we always had, since the beginning of our company, we've supported distributed teams and remote work. And we're going to continue to do that as we move forward. So that's a little about me, and we'll jump in. Steph.
Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about what teams look like in a post-pandemic world. And I guess one question to start us off is, what is it like to lead a technical team today?
Yeah, well, today, there is no such thing as a single office space. In so many companies and even across the government, we're really expanding to this global office where the workplace isn't just a physical place, it's just wherever your workers may be. And so leading a team can mean really just trying to make sure that you're connecting and communicating with these people who are geographically spread out. And so that looks a lot different than when you could just walk down to the next cubicle and have everyone in arm's reach. However, there is a sense of instantaneous communication also with the technology that we're using where, everyone is reachable at almost all times now because we don't have to wait for them to be in the exact physical location that we're in. Another thing that really defines the landscape right now, especially for the types of teams that I help lead, which are primarily engineering teams, software development teams. You have a lot of engineers all touching the same code, and you have a lot of people all trying to work on a project together when they're all spread out. So shoulder surfing looks a lot different. Instead of actually sitting next to someone, you're screen sharing and you're collaborating. And so you still have the same problems of how do we make sure that everyone is in sync while we're not together? And how do we make sure that everyone is touching the same code and making changes and actually contributing effectively without being able to meet up in person and have some of those physical conversations about it. And another thing too is that right now we're in this ramp up kind of era right now. There's better technology, better methodologies constantly coming out as technology gets better, as we find new needs in this new world where we're all physically disparate. we have to adjust and adapt to those methodologies, to that technology, and we have to make sure that we adapt faster than our competitor. So leading those teams can be really difficult because you want to make sure that you're keeping your team on the cutting edge. You want to make sure that everyone's collaborating effectively, and also that you're communicating effectively as a leader, making everyone feel safe and confident, even when you're not with them.
And the only thing I'll add to that, Steph, is that, remote, hybrid, and in-person are three distinct scenarios. Even hybrid has its own kind of caveats. And different personalities fit into those differently. There are plenty of people that excel in the office and can't handle remote, but we also have people that absolutely blow it away when they're remote, and when they're in their office, they're distracted, right? So we've got to kind of keep, as someone who builds teams as well, we've got to keep an eye on those personalities and get to know those people on our team. You can't ever be a hands-off manager anymore. It's just not a thing. You've got to be on the floor. You've got to be involved. You got to know your people. So that's the only thing that's a little different. And the hybrid makes it even tougher because you're constantly context switching, right? Is this person in the office today? Are they here? Are they not? They've got a lot more plates in the air. So it's a little bit tougher as a manager, and you need to be aware of the personalities and the people that work.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like almost just as much about, even more so about managing the people in those relationships as it is the actual work and technology.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, given this picture and kind of these intricacies of remote work and how to best manage teams, how do we have the confidence that we're producing the best code possible given these circumstances, would you say?
So we're going to talk about a few of those tenets here today, and we're going to go over them. But the main theme throughout is going to be communication, right? That's the only way you're going to solve this problem. Tools can help, but you never want, when we'll talk about this a little bit, you never want to work for the tool. You want to set your tools to help you the best. You need, like I said, you need to be there with that buy-in every day within the team. As a manager, you're part of the team. You're not hovering over it. You're part of it. And that old-fashioned way of I can bounce in and out and not even check in, maybe get a status report once a week, get that out of your mind. It's gone. Direction from leadership has to be clear. We need to actually communicate to the team and with the team and receive its full feedback. And like we mentioned, it's all about the people processes. It's not about documentation necessarily. It's not about, setting standards, although those are part of it. It's still working with each individual and the team as a whole and how they have a dynamic and a culture. With that, then we can actually implement automated processes and ways to share knowledge best, depending on the scenario people are working. So we'll first talk about communication with your team, but Aubrey, I think we have a little poll here.
Yes, we do. So essentially, we'd love to know from you what kind of tools have been the most effective for communication in your team.
And I'm actually really interested to see some of these responses here because, working with certain tools, you can get comfortable and you can be like, okay, well, this is my go-to for this. This is what I'm using for, instant messaging my team. This is what I'm using to communicate just through email, or this is how I'm, docu-sharing, whatever the case. But I think, it's awesome to see what other people are doing and what's really effective out there.
And it's funny when you run into another team that uses a different tool but equivalent. Like if you're a team's, like we're Teams people over here, and you meet a Zoom group, you're like, oh my gosh, heresy, what are you guys doing? So
guys,
you have to switch.
vice versa.
Yeah. Even though we know they all have their major quirks and problems, so it's not all like one's really better than the other.
So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'm going to go ahead and share those results. All right, so we've got Google Chat, Mail, Documents, Video Meet, GitHub, SpirePlan, text-based chat, lots of Teams, and another SpirePlan. Slack, WhatsApp, Jira, Slack.
WhatsApp, really?
Yeah. We actually use with, some of our in EMEA and South America partners and customers and stuff. I think it's a little more common.
Yeah.
And then internet through remote access applications.
Yeah, I mean, it runs the gamut, right? That's an interesting point about WhatsApp when you're working internationally. You know, as a federal sector group, we don't do a lot of international, but we've done some stuff before with folks that are deployed. We actually had people in Afghanistan for a while, and communicating with them was tough because their internet was entirely unreliable out there. So yeah, we did use third-party tools like that. So that's an interesting take as well.
Mhm.
But you know, as you can see, everybody uses their own set of tools, right? And there's a lot of things that can be swapped out. You know, in Inspire Plan, I'll say the name that can't be said here or shouldn't is Jira, right? There's an equivalent there as well. Of course, one's better than the other. There's, you know, but it's that adaptation that you get into a culture and a routine with using those tools. So the one thing I just wanted to talk about when it comes to those tools is teams sometimes get forced to work to their tools. Um, Tools have rigid ways to do things. Like I said, they all have quirks and issues that they run into, and you end up making your work and your people have their patterns fit the tool. You want to try to avoid that as best as possible. I know it's not always easy, right? But your team should work to the way that your team wants to work. If a tool doesn't work for you, consider replacing it, right? I know it's hard to do sometimes, but if you don't like Jira, look at something else, right? If Slack is too restrictive with the new ways that they license things out, look at Mattermost. Look at, you know, even Discord, right? There's all kinds of things out there that are alternatives. Don't be afraid to make the tools work for you. I've seen way too many times where people say, well, you know, this is not the most efficient process, but the tool that we have to use makes us do it. If a tool is making you do something inefficient, it's not a tool you should be using. Tools are there to help, not to hinder. But like I said, they can be a dependency and a roadblock, and you want to try to break those down. So don't be afraid to question your tools. When it comes to the remote collaboration part of things, you need to rely on the human element of the tool. Make sure that you're always getting that personal part in there. You can sometimes lose, you know, a little of the humanity through the rigidity of a tool. You know, oh, we have a ticket. You got to put a ticket in for everything. Well, sure, put the ticket in for everything too, just to track it, but call the person as well, right? Pick up the phone, send an actual email, chat with them and say, hey, you know, I just put in a ticket. It's got these details. It's really affecting me in this way. When you get around to it, let me know. Start a conversation. Don't just rely on that process. You need to balance that face-to-face with things like chat and bring it out to the group so you can expose the problems and the issues you're having to the rest of the group. I know that, you know, there's the opposite side of just putting things in tools is saying meetings. We're going to meet over everything. And meeting overload is a real problem as well. It's something that we've run into a lot. But no matter what you do, you've got to talk to people. You know, I see it even today where someone will say, well, you know, I put in a ticket and it's been 3 weeks and I don't know what's going on. Well, you got to follow up, right? Like you've got to talk to the person. So I think that's the key. So Steph, you want to add a little bit on that? You know, I know that you agree with this. You've seen this before too.
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of the big things, you're talking about that human piece that we do miss out on when we're not together in the office is some of those visual cues that sometimes you can lose through chat methods, interpreting tone, determining what someone's true meaning is, things like that. Of course, we've got a bunch of additional bonuses, like we can send gifts to each other, we can use emojis, things like that.
Memes are a powerful tool.
Yeah, and it really it's team bonding, it's team building. So a lot of times like we maybe don't feel like everyone's engaging when we have all of our cameras off, like different little things that like can be standard on one team but different on another. I think that there's no right or wrong way to go about it, but I think that in my experience, I tend to keep my camera on more often than not. And just having one person in the room in the meeting with their camera on can actually impact the rest of the team. And suddenly more people have their camera on and more people are participating in that way. And not every day I look cute. So it's not every day that I'm on camera, but you know, in general, you can't hear when someone is nodding at you and following along, and you can't see that engagement unless you can see their face sometimes. But at the same time, you're talking about like meeting overload, like it's also healthy to say, no to some communication. It's healthy to block off time and encourage your teammates to do that. I know that you and the co-founder Jack like really are always telling us this on our team. You're saying, hey, put time in your schedule, put an appointment in your schedule that says this is my solitary work time. That way it's blocked out and people know, and people can respect your time in that way too. And I know that this might be a little old school, and you kind of like hinted at this too, but just calling someone up for, you know, something that's needed, not super urgently, but something that you want a direct answer to. Sometimes chatting back and forth can get a little muddy. Sometimes it's easier to just explain what you mean. So don't be afraid to just encourage your team to feel like they can just call each other and talk to each other. And if you see like a random Teams message or Teams call coming in, it's also okay to reject that. But just like making sure that those kind of boundaries are felt out. I feel like these tools are, you know, just like what we have in the real world, but just our virtualized versions. So a lot of it is really just common sense and going back to the human of it all.
Absolutely. Nice pub conf call back there, Steph. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are all really great points. I feel like I relate to this a lot because I used to work at Inflectra in person at the office, and you know, I could turn around, ask questions, and talk to people immediately. But then going remote, you kind of have to make more of an effort to give people a call, set up a little meeting, and kind of make those personal relationships or build those personal relationships a little more. So yeah, these are all great ideas, and I think it kind of applies to all teams. But I guess one thing that I'd pose a question for is, are there any specific inter-team communication strategies for development teams in particular?
Steph, you want to take this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, you know, especially when we're talking about development teams, like the way that developers like to communicate is through code. We've, you know, seen infrastructure as code, configuration as code, all these things. I feel like this is kind of like the techie way to say it, but like anything that you can codify, you say this is whatever it is as code. So why not communication as code? Because really, what is the code that we're writing, right? That's instructions for what's happening. That's explaining what we're building. So my advice for development teams is that to communicate better with each other, codify everything, all of your everyday processes, all of your tasks, turn them into version controlled, repeatable code. Make sure that you're using self-documenting features and features that encourage documentation within your development, whatever language you're writing in, and make sure that you're really, as you're writing your code, you're making it super easy for someone to come in behind you and know exactly what's going on. It's just as important for the code to be machine readable as it is for it to be human readable. And oftentimes when you're going to review someone's code, you can kind of step into a spaghetti mess and be totally turned around and not understand what's going on, especially teams that can be working on really complex problems. So it's important for us to be commenting, for us to be documenting, and for us to be making sure that our process and the way that we do things is version controlled and repeatable.
Right. And I think a key to that is understanding and agreeing on some things for consistency. You know, we've all seen Silicon Valley, and we know that relationships can actually be started and ended over bracket styles. So if you want to come to an agreement, at least come to a convention, right? Try not to be too clever. Encourage your engineers, you know, that cleverness is not something that's really, it might feel good. You know, oh, look, I can do this in 2 lines using, you know, 3-letter variables or something like that. That's not something that should be really encouraged. I want to move towards being as verbose as possible in the code, really telling people a story as you go through it. I want to see inline comments, right? Your thinking process. You know, well, I thought this would behave this way, but it behaves this way, so I'm putting an error check in here. Make sure that you're actually doing a narrative throughout your code. And when you do the peer reviews, if you see something that's just blank of any commentary, take it back. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about peer reviews, but you know, make sure those go back to the developer and say, look, I need a little more of your thought process in here. And one thing I'm big on is change logs, right? So if you're done doing something, I want to see something updated in the documentation that's in source control that says, here's why I did that, right? There's comments on merge requests, but not everyone's going to see that. The changelog is published with your release, and anybody, a user, administrator, stakeholder, can look at it and say, okay, I understand what the thought process was here. So just I want to get away from the culture of, well, it works. It's not just that it works. We need to understand why things are doing what they're doing. And that's something we need to add into our code to help it communicate better. So guys, we have one more poll.
Yes, we have one more poll. So the question is, what has been the biggest challenge on your team? I'm going to launch it now. So we have technological or interpersonal. This is both regarding communication, right, Stephanie and Chris?
Yeah.
It is.
But I guess in general, just like, what is the more difficult thing for you to deal with, the technological issues or the interpersonal issues?
All right, it looks like we have almost everyone's responses in, and we've got about 80% of people who said technological and 20%
Really?
interpersonal.
All right, interesting.
So given this, we have a combination of both, personal difference about how to communicate using the technology.
That's fair too. That's fair.
So let's move on a little bit into another stream of communication. We've talked about how teams communicate internally, but what about how specifically, or how leadership can specifically improve effective communication?
So one of the biggest challenges that you face as a leader is, how do we get the team from point A to point B, right? Like that's our whole goal. So in the context of project planning, or kind of planning out the tasks that your team is going to do, being able to spread out those responsibilities and determining what direction the team is going to move in, it's critical that we are really clear with our communication from the beginning, because a lot of those technological and interpersonal issues that we're going to run into are very interconnected.
And I want, it's interesting that people said, the comment about a combination of both personal and technological, right? And I think a good place where we see those two kind of meet up is in testing, right? Because tests are things that you automate them, but they're giving you a view into the status of the system. And in my mind, tests are a very good form of communication. There's a tendency sometimes with developers to want to see, I want all my tests to pass, right? And there's a danger a little bit in that, wanting everything to go green. In my view, I like to see some of that red. It lets me know where things need attention, and it lets me know where we need to focus on improvement. You don't want to try to mask that. You want to fail very fast and early. If we have problems, I want to see all those up front. I never want, if I start something new, a new project, a new module, a new component, and within a week or the second sprint or something like that, someone tells me, oh, all the tests are passing, everything's fine, I'm going to be very, very suspicious, right? So failure is okay. Failure is good. Failure means you're identifying problems. It's okay to find things that you need to improve. Do not try to sweep things under the rug. There's some teams that I've been with that say, we want a 0 defect rate. I want no test, by the end of each sprint, everything needs to be 0. Well, okay, you want releasable software at the end of the sprint. You want things to work at the end of the sprint. But arbitrarily saying that you've got to cover up all your errors and make all tests pass, not a good idea. So we want to make sure we have full code coverage of your tests, and that your tests are verbose. When they fail, it's not just, well, it didn't work, right? Tell me why. And troubleshooting is where all teams, I think, meet their threshold of where their communication fails or succeeds, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. So Steph, you want to add a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, really, that's what it is. Like, as a leader, like, you are able to set the tone on your team and make it a safe environment where people feel okay failing, because that's like how we improve, making sure that everyone feels like you're communicating through these tests, we're talking through these tests, they're a tool, and that we're not feeling like they're a grade, and that they're, representative of the person who wrote the code, because that's just really not true. And failing is like what's actually going to propel us forward.
Steph, did you have some more comments on project planning or anything like that? Or is that something you wanted to? You good to go?
Yeah. I don't know if we got ahead a little bit, if maybe we could go back like 3 slides. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about just kind of like even like building off of that, like setting the tone as a leader, setting the tone as to what we're doing together, what's okay for the team. As a leader, like it's our job to determine direction for our team. And so we set the tone and just enable everyone to be comfortable in that space. So as we're developing our strategy for where we're going with the project, our job is to get everyone to achieve a collective understanding of the project requirements, the dependencies, the blockers, really with communication at the forefront. We want to create an environment where people feel like there are no dumb questions, and make sure that people are not afraid to ask questions, and that things can be openly stated, that people can openly say, I don't think that's a good idea, or I'm afraid to do that because XYZ, or I don't have the experience in this and I need help. All of those things are actually great signs if people on your team are saying those things, because it means that they're comfortable in leaning on the team and in wanting to learn and grow, because there's no way that as developers, your team is going to learn and grow if they feel like there are rules that they can't actually ask the questions to gain the knowledge that they need. One really important part of being a good leader and kind of creating the safe space is also to focus on spreading out responsibilities and making sure that people feel like they have ownership of something. A really effective way to make someone feel like they are learning and growing is to say that they can run something from start to finish and say, I did that, I completed that. And that's really awesome for them. And it doesn't mean that they can't lean on others throughout the experience, but basically when we spread out responsibility so that everyone has ownership over something, then things don't fall through the crack. And so people can say, I own this completely, and I'm not going to say, oh, someone else will get to it. Another thing too that you see, especially with different personalities, people will say, okay, that's not in my comfort zone. That's not a thing that I want to do. This person is great. I'm on a team right now, and there's one person in particular who is just awesome at doing some firewall stuff. And so every time something comes down where it's a firewall task, we say, okay, this is going to her. And she is really great at it, but it has created kind of this after effect of the rest of us not being familiar enough with that work to take it on. So you really want to make sure that you're spreading out that knowledge, because what happens if you're expert, that single point of failure that you have is gone one day, or maybe that person, for whatever reason, can't be there for an extended period of time or leaves the company. Like, you really put yourself in a disadvantage by pigeonholing people into specific tasks, especially.
Yeah, can I just add right there? It's like it's fine to have experts, and it's good. You want them, and not everybody has to be an expert in everything.
Yeah,
but you want to. It's a very fine line. You want people to be moving towards that greater understanding of things, and you want to try to identify when you have a single expert or somebody that you rely on for everything, and take proactive action to kind of spread that out and get somebody to at least shadow or be a backup to that person, because we've seen it all the time where, oh, this person was the pro at this and they're moving on, right? And that puts you in a real bind.
Yeah, exactly. And one way to like kind of create that culture is by leading by example. So when we communicate this way, when we talk about things that are inside our comfort zone or outside of our comfort zone, or talk about ways that we're stretching and growing, we can encourage our team to do the same. And especially in the case when you have a technical lead leading a technical team, someone with that background and experience to relate to them. That's not always the case, and that's actually totally okay as well. But especially with communication, if you want your team to not be afraid to like raise those risks and concerns, those fears, even if you will, like, okay, this is something that could go wrong. That's okay to say, because everyone needs to be aware of those things. That starts by you as the leader talking candidly about your concerns, and that will kind of trickle down into making sure that everyone else can feel comfortable doing the same.
Absolutely. And yeah, I'm sorry, it looks like we skipped ahead one, but we can talk about this a little bit too. We talked already a little bit about psychological safety, making sure that, you know, everybody feels like they can speak up regularly. And as a leader, that's your job, to protect that and to make sure that everybody's heard. And I know everybody's been in these scrums, been in these meetings where there's one loud voice, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's some people that are vocal and passionate, and let them be vocal and passionate, but make sure that they're not steamrolling somebody else. And if there's somebody that hasn't gotten the opportunity to you know, chime in or do whatever they do, make sure you make some space for them to do that. And they might not feel comfortable. You know, and if you find someone that's not contributing, it might not necessarily be that they don't want to. They may have a block on doing that. Pull them aside on your own separately and say, hey, you know, I noticed you haven't really been speaking up. Is there anything you want to bring up? Can I help you? You know, a little bit, run some interference for you, protect you when you want to get these ideas out. And that's your job as a leader, to adapt to those people. And even somebody who does speak a lot, say, hey, you know, okay, got what you're saying. Let's give it a beat and let someone else join in. But what you're saying is entirely valuable, and make sure that you rotate through that and keep an eye on that. It is your job to do that as a leader.
Absolutely. The message of how we lead and communicate is really, we're giving it in a technological context, but it really applies to every industry. So regardless of what you may be working in right now, in an industry where practices and technology changes so often, it's really important to know that it's okay to make mistakes and ask questions, because the landscape is constantly changing.
100%.
Absolutely. And before we move on to the next subject, I thought we could end off. Shuram wrote a really nice comment in the chat, which was, it's a phrase. He says, not to just fail fast, but fail forward. If we have failed, but have not learned from failure, then we are not failing forward. Which I thought was interesting. It kind of gets back to that, creating a safe space and making it a place for people to make mistakes and giving them the opportunity to learn from it and try again. So that's a great phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next up on the agenda is people processes. So what exactly do you mean by that?
So we did jump ahead. I apologize for that. We already talked a little bit about testless communication, right? So we can move over that. Sorry, I'm not, you know, I'm trying to navigate a little bit here. But let's talk a little bit about peer review, right? Because peer review is another place I think that sometimes is glossed over, and it seems more of a tedious chore than something that's actually helpful. But it really is something that's very important, can really actually bring your team together. We all know as engineers, we focus on a problem, we get zoned in, and that's not a bad thing, but you get a set of context in your head, and you're like looping through that problem. We all know that sometimes you walk away, you let it go for a minute, you come back, you're like, oh, that's what I did. You know what I mean? You realize that when you step away, and more so when you get a fresh set of eyes on the problem. Somebody might even, it's better if somebody isn't experienced in the code that you're working on or the problem you're working on, because they'll be doing a little learning there, and they might investigate things that you take for granted and that you glossed over after 20 years of doing the same thing. So even getting someone who isn't an expert can definitely help you on that, getting those multiple eyes on the code. You know, we've had teams where we go through team merge requests every Wednesday at 2 o'clock or something like that, just to understand what everybody's working on. Because the Scrum is a 15-minute thing. You know, I'm one of the old Agile adherents that says Scrum is not a status. The Scrum is, what do I need from you? What can you do for me? Status is more something that's shared organically, I think, versus in a report. And that's why peer review is really a great place to do that and find out where people are running into roadblocks and, you know, how far along folks are, and maybe you can help out. I will say though, you have to have a little rigidity with a peer review. You want to make sure that, you know, you don't have the same two developers proving each other's code every time.
Those two, we're just going to auto approve everything that each other.
You're my buddy, I'm your buddy, we're just going to do whatever, right? So no, you got to wrote somebody, maybe someone who's a little bit critical and antagonistic, put them in there. You know, more than two, right? It's got to be three. It's that old voting logic thing where, you know, a vote of one or two is just flipping a coin. So at that point, you need somebody to weigh it over to one side or the other. And like I said, they need to get those new eyes on the reviews, experienced and non-experienced. All of them can help. Junior folks, like they said, they're in that learning mode. So they're going to find things that you're not going to see, that your eyes are just going to pass over. Make sure that you use the tools, again, inside your repo so you get alerts when things are merged, when things are broadcast, when people have comments. I've seen so many GitLabs set up where the emails and the alerts don't work. And people are like, oh, that got merged in? I didn't know that because I didn't check for 2 weeks, right? Again, back to being verbose in your merges. We already talked a little bit about that. But then the key at the end is make sure that you run automation. You know, when we were working with Chef, we'd always kick off cook style. If you're working with Python, you do something like talks, make sure you lint. There's a million things that you can do built into the code to get that feedback when you actually do a merge instantly, to avoid a lot of the problems where it's like, oh, you know, I forgot to close this up or move this to, you know, add a semicolon or bracket or something silly like that. But that'll reduce the overhead for manual testing. And then that during that peer review, you can actually talk about the process, the high level things and the problems you're trying to solve. So we're going to talk a little bit more about those automated processes.
Before you get into that, I do have a quick question from someone who wrote a question down in the Q&A box. So how do you effectively manage change in an organization with high risk appetite for human capital loss?
High risk appetite for human capital loss? Are you talking about if you have like turnover in your team? Is that what they're getting at?
My sense is that it's for high turnover rate. But
yeah,
Steve,
so
to put in the chat if we're getting it wrong. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you are talking about, you know, a high turnover team, which does happen, continuity is the thing that you've got to focus on, and that's the hard thing to do, right? And it's easy to say that we're going to put all our knowledge in a wiki and that's going to be the answer. And that's really not the answer, because you can never get the equivalent of somebody actually explaining it to you. That's where you can get into a little bit more of, you know, some tricky things that you can do. But some people like to record discussions like this, you know, record the last few scrums. And if you know somebody new's coming on, maybe have them go and revisit that to get some of the team culture. I would say that you need to try as a leader as well to understand some of the technical problems so you can communicate them when you do have gaps in staff. To me, the age of the non-technical leader, I mean, in the 70s and the 80s, that wasn't a thing. You know, you had people working for Hewlett Packard, the managers were engineers. Then we went into a mentality that we were managing business processes, not engineering processes. And I think it's coming back where you have to, as a manager, as a leader, have a technical understanding of what your team's doing, because you're the one that's probably maintaining that communication as people come and go. And Sharam, you're right. If you're having, I heard someone, I think at the beginning of the question say something about high performance, because I want to be careful about that term. A lot of people use that as an excuse. They say high performance, and what they really mean is they have a cutthroat culture. And that's not, you got to be, and I know some companies that's just the way it is. But being, you know, getting rid of somebody because they don't do something perfectly, or getting a culture where people want to leave, that's a problem. That's not a good thing. That's not high performance, right? High performance is your output. Your team should be metriced on results. You should be results oriented. I know there's a lot of people that consider themselves rock stars and they only want to deal with rock stars. Not everybody's going to be a rock star. And if everybody's a rock star on the team, that variation is going to be so little, you know, you're going to, the 80% rule is going to cut out somebody anyway if they just, you know, are slightly below the curve. That is a toxic environment to deal with something like that. I want to make sure, you know, I've never seen a team where people turn over rapidly be successful. You need some of that institutional knowledge. If you're cutting people in and out real quick because, you know, they don't get up to it in 2 weeks or something like that, you're probably missing a certain type of thought process and a certain type of person that would actually be beneficial to your team, that might take a bigger picture versus a detailed picture.
Yeah.
So I
The
want to be
only,
careful about that.
The only thing I want to point out is like the only exception I can think of to that, to saying that when you have really high turnover, you probably have a toxic workplace, is in the case that maybe you have like a training environment and maybe you're spinning people up and getting them through a pipeline or something like that. And in that case, it's all about those processes. It's all an introduction and it's all for learning purposes. So if you're stuck in an environment like that and you want to make it better, that's really what you can focus on.
And I've seen people, developers say, hey, look, the training here needs some help. I wrote up this plan. You know, as an individual contributor, you can go outside of your realm a little bit and maybe offer that. And leaders should encourage that, don't reject, right? If you see somebody saying, hey, the training sucks here. So I wrote up this guide on how to do something. Don't say, well, that's not what you're supposed to work on. Embrace that. That's a signal that something's wrong and that you need to address it. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for answering that question. That was great. Hopefully we got what you were wanting, Stephen. If not, you can continue to put questions in the box. So let's kind of dive a little bit more back into the technical side of things. Let's talk about the automated processes that can improve team communication and cohesion. But before we kind of dive into the content, we do have a last poll question about the development environment that you have. So how would you describe your development environments? First option, they're perfect. You have all the tools you need and they're responsive, up to date, and flexible. And then the second one is they need some improvement. While you might have some tools and spaces, you could always use a little bit more resources and you wish more attention was paid to development environments. The last one is they're lacking. Development environments seem to be somewhat of an afterthought and you're constantly fighting tools versus being enabled by them. It's a great question.
I'm really curious about this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Wait a minute
I
or
want to
two.
meet these people with the perfect environments. That's
Yeah, we could learn from them, right?
Right.
yeah.
How do you have a perfect environment?
It looks like most of the people, actually everyone who has responded, most of them have picked they need improvement.
Yep. And
There's
that's totally what I would expect, right? Environments by definition are an experiment in compromise. Like you're picking tools, you have security restrictions, you have all kinds of stuff. So Steph, why don't you jump in here and we can talk a little bit more about the importance of environments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the purpose of having a test environment or a development environment is so that you can actually develop code that is going to behave the way that it's going to when it's in production. So you want to have a test environment that really closely mirrors the real life setup of your live nodes and that minimizes that variability of results from environment to environment. That being said, production just is different than dev. It just is. And a lot of times you might have higher security restrictions. I know a lot of times, like I'll work with teams where we develop unclass and we push up. And so that environment is very different when it's actually live. But if there are unavoidable differences, make sure that the team is aware of what those differences are. And then we understand them because we can actually write tests for the test machine. And it's important to note and share the information about what could be different in a real environment. And it's really important that everyone communicates effectively and understands those differences, because the last thing that you want is a bomb to go off when you push up code that's working perfectly well in your test environment and suddenly it's not working in production where it might quote unquote actually matter. So yeah, I'll throw it over to you, Chris.
No, and it's the old IT as a cost center fallacy, right? It's the setting up an environment costs money. It's not cheap. It's the first thing that a lot of organizations will do, and they'll see the bills and they'll say, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. I have to have 5 environments that do the same thing. Why do we need that? Well, it's because if you don't have the right environment, it's going to cost you in the long run. Developers need to move that through different stages. And if you want any kind of parallelism, you have to have some parallel environments. So it's really worth the investment. And if you can kind of, make the case to your leadership that there is always a return on investment when it comes to helping the developer environment. Even little things like if you're running a slow remote desktop and it takes developers an extra 2 seconds to right click on the context menu of their IDEs, they do that 200 times a day. You're losing half an hour there. So in per developer. So you can really make a case when it comes to environments and say, look, these little things, these day in the life things that help a developer be efficient, takes their mind. It's like when you're flying an airplane, they talk about information overload and cockpit resource management. To fly a plane, you need to concentrate on aviating first. When you're developing, you need to concentrate on solving the problem first. Every little distraction takes away from your capacity to problem solve, which is your main job. So if you're spending half an hour saying, well, why won't this log in? Or why can't I get this into the right file format? Or that I'm being bounced out of GitLab. That's keeping the brain power away from doing the job that you're paying your folks to do. So it's very important to make sure the developments are as low resistance as possible. So we're going to jump next to this one. Steph, one thing I did want to mention too, when you're done with this, we'll talk a little bit about lexicons. I don't think we have it in the slides, but let me jump in after this. You go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to your point of, okay, what is worth the time of an engineer versus what is not? And I think one thing that we can all agree on is that things that can be automated, when we use automation to run our tests and run our linting, we can actually cut out some of those monotonous tasks. Me clicking a button 5 times to make sure that something happens, we can have a machine do that. So when we set up automation, for example, like within our Git repository, we can set up so that when code is pushed to any branch, tests run automatically. And so this is going to be triggered by the SCM tool right on check-in. We can also enforce common code styling. We talked about linting beforehand, but we can just make a rule like, hey, we're going to have linting run automatically. It's going to be shown for everyone in the pipeline. And a merge cannot be accepted without a clean lint. So when we set up these automated processes for ourselves, they might feel like guardrails. Oh, I can't finish my code until my tests are a certain way and my linting is a certain way. But the thing is that when all of that is automated for us, that means that I, going in to review someone's code, don't have to pull down their code and run all these checks on my own, because that's like work that a machine can do. And I can actually use my time and energy to review the code more critically, and also use my time solving more complex problems. The more often that you run tests on your code, the clearer picture of health that you're going to get about your code. And this is all part of that communication we're talking about with testing, like the clear picture of code health overall.
All right. I believe this is our last.
It is. Yeah, I know we're pushing time, but yeah.
We'll keep it within the hour slot. I think we're doing great. So the last knowledge sharing topic. So Chris, given your background across the public and private sectors, you probably deal with a lot of teams that operate very differently from one another. So how do you best understand a team when you move from one team to the next?
So I'm actually going to call out Steph here a little bit as an example, because it happened organically. Steph, when you were discussing something, you said something that I think was natural to you and natural to me, but other people might not understand. You said, I push up from one class.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't work in the federal sphere, you might be like, well, what are you talking about? Right. So we have unclassified environments. We have classified environments. Things only go one way. We'll say, oh, we'll push up from one class. That means it's going from unclassified to classified. Every team has its own kind of lexicon, right? Every industry has its own lexicon. We've been working with a group out in the Pacific Northwest that does logistics, and they have an entirely different language than federal sector people, right? So we want to try to, when new people come in, they're going to be like, what is this? I have no idea. Well, what's a CDRL? What's a TRF? We talked about that today. There's things that you guys will think are just natural everyday things that new people and outsiders won't understand. So there's some history, there's some good parts to that, because these things often have a history that explains why things are the way they are, right? We do things a certain way. The language we speak is evolved because it comes over the history of a project and problems that we've run into. So again, job as a leader and encourage everybody else, be verbose about that and talk about the history of why we do things and say things the way that we do. and try to get people into that language if you need be. You're not going to get rid of it, right? You're not going to have somebody say, well, we're going to explain everything and not use jargon. You want to try to minimize it, but you're never going to get away from it, especially in something like an institutional group or a government group. So it's key to know that people that have not even been in your sector, we go from intelligence community to Space Force. I've heard people using the word vector check all the time. Like, what the heck's a vector check? I've never heard that. Now, Steph, having an Air Force husband, probably knows what that is. Probably heard people say that before. We'd call it something else in another group, even though it's government. So make sure that you're clear in your language, and when you are using that jargon, take some time to maybe every once in a while give an explanation of the why that is. But get people up to speed on that. And there's going to be some resistance. There's going to be some people saying, I'm not going to use that language. That's fine. Let them do that, right? Let them be generic. Say, I'm not going to do a vector check. I'm going to get a status report. So allow that to happen organically, but be aware of language, because it can be very intimidating and off-putting. And that goes along to the bigger picture of culture, that the biggest part of making a team work together is having people fit into that culture. And you will run into the situation where sometimes there is somebody who is not going to fit into your culture, and that's okay. You may have to work that person. Maybe they're better in a different part of the organization. Try to make it the best you can, make them fit in, make them feel comfortable, but it's not always going to work. But I would say above technical, making sure that you have that culture and that common communication language will let you solve the technical. So don't ignore it. I know it's easy to focus on the technical, but that's the last thing I'd leave this with is culture and communication. Make sure that you're aware of it as a leader, and make sure that you open that up to everybody that you can. So as we said, there's no secret formula. A team that communicates effectively is a confident and successful.
Exactly.
So if anyone has any additional questions, pop them in real quick. You also feel free to email Inflectra. What is the best way to reach you guys?
LinkedIn or through the TapHere website. All our stuff's on there. We're open. We like to talk to everybody. And yes, Saram, great comments during this. I really appreciate that. That was great.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for sharing all of your ideas. I know I definitely walked away learning some things, so I really appreciate it. And
thanks for having us, Audrey.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks everyone for joining as well. Thank you so much for coming along. And again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Be safe, make good choices.